Welcome to Rebel Tales. I'm your host, Dwayne Crowley. I took some extra time with this episode. I'm getting used to making podcasts, but I actually didn't realise the amount of work involved in researching, recording, and editing and putting it all together. So, mistakes will be made, but I just want to make sure that the information that I'm putting out there is the most accurate possible. It's funny actually, when I was putting this episode together, it was a beautiful day, so I brought the books out to Kilmichael to sit on the benches out there. There's a beautiful picnic spot out there. It's, a fantastic, very peaceful place now. And it was great to see so many people out there, families and people bringing their kids and just people out there to try and learn about the place and what happened. And I was speaking to a lovely woman who was out there having a picnic with her grandkids. And we got talking and we had a nice chat about the local area and what she knew about the War of Independence. I'd say we were there for about 20 minutes with some stories, and she had some great stories, but I didn't ask her permission to share them, so I won't. And after that I went down to the Kilmurry War of Independence Museum. I've been there a couple of times because the collection that they have down there is absolutely outstanding. They even have a wheel from one of the Crossley tender lorries that carried the British to Kilmichael during the ambush. And I had a great chat with Maria down there. She's the local historian, and she actually put me in contact with another historian who I had a chat with over the phone. And that's really what I love about Irish history, hearing the local stories that you might not get anywhere else, the stories of the people that don't generally make it into books or the podcasts. So, following on from last week, I hope you enjoyed hearing the stories from the men who were there at Kilmichael, and I named all 46 of them, including the unarmed scouts, but I forgot to mention the 47th person, which was a woman named Josie Coughlin, and she was there totally by accident. She brought a big bucket of tea down to the men, and just as the ambush was kicking off, she didn't have time to escape, so she actually had to hide face down in a ditch during the ambush, which must have been an absolutely terrifying experience for her. But if you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode yet, I'd recommend going back to that and just listening to that before we dive into this one. Because in that episode I read the accounts of what happened from the perspectives of Tom Barry and Paddy O'Brien, as well as a battlefield post-mortem really from Eve Morrison's book. This week I'll be looking at the most controversial aspect of the Kilmichael ambush. Was there a false surrender by the British forces? Did some of the auxiliary division of the Royal Irish Constabulary, who were commissioned officers in the British Army during the First World War, call out that they surrender, throw down their rifles and lead the volunteers out of cover, before pulling their sidearms and shooting between 2 and 3 of the volunteers? Or did those auxiliaries give a surrender that wasn't accepted, throwing down their arms, and were they executed anyway? Were those volunteers already dead before that false surrender, if it happened? This episode will pull from multiple sources, and both sides of the argument are very convincing, but I hope to give you a full picture as much as we possibly can anyway in an hour-long podcast, and as much as we can 100 years on from the ambush. So, the false surrender, Tom Barry said, was a trick that is as old as war itself. And even though there are cases of many armies using tricks that I think are called perfidy under the international rules of war, acts such as like false surrender or pretending to be dead and then firing at an enemy or wearing a red cross symbol when you're actually a soldier, those types of things. Although I couldn't find too many examples from the British Army during World War I, we saw in the Clonmult ambush a few months after Kilmichael, in February of 1921, there was a big battle there between the auxiliaries and the local volunteers. And after a while, the auxiliaries burned the building that the volunteers were in by setting fire to the roof, and some of the volunteers actually surrendered. And after they surrendered, they were executed on the spot. And according to Patrick Higgins, who survived the battle, he said that after the surviving volunteers surrendered, we were lined up against the outhouse with our hands up. The Tans came along and shot every man with the exception of 3, who were saved by the officer in charge of the military party. A tan put his revolver to my mouth and fired. Only for the military officer coming along, I would be gone. And Pat was actually injured. He was wounded in the jaw when that tan put the revolver in his mouth. So this is another reason to believe that the auxiliaries were not the gentlemen officers that some revisionist historians would have you believe. So why is there a question mark over whether or not there was a false surrender? In Paddy O'Brien's account that was published in Liam Deasy's book Towards Ireland Free, which I read last week on that episode, there was no mention of the false surrender in that. And later on there are some conflicting accounts from the men who were there, but there are also some factors to take into consideration before we dive into that. So we know that these men were not trained and battle-hardened soldiers like the commissioned officers of the British Army that made up the ranks of the auxiliaries. There was bound to be some level of confusion. These men were experiencing the shock of battle for the first time. They had marched from 3 a.m. the night before to 8 a.m. in horrible conditions. They were laying outside in the freezing cold and wet conditions of an Irish November without anything to eat, and the darkness of a winter night was setting in as the battle started. Now, a lot of those conditions, you'll know, in Ireland, in November, it starts to get dark in and around 4:30. When it rains, it's so cold out there, it's just intense conditions. Add that in with extreme hunger and marching in the dark, and they must have been in an awful condition before the battle started anyway. And the fight itself was fast and ferocious. It lasted about 20 minutes based on some accounts, and it must have been very loud. It must have been terrifying and confusing for the men who had never seen battle. And to top it off, part of it was fought hand to hand on the road because there was so little ammunition available for the volunteers. I think there was between 30 and 32 rounds for the 36 riflemen that were stationed there at Kilmichael. And I don't think that would have lasted very long based on some of the accounts that I've read from battlefield historians. So the shock after that event must have been intense, and Tom Barry himself talks about parading the men amongst the dead, intending to pull them back into the soldier's mindset in case they were attacked on the way back to the safe house. There's a great book actually by Sean Murphy. He wrote a battlefield study of Kilmichael, really well researched book, and it's very much from a military perspective. It probably went over my head a few times now, but I'm sure if anybody is in the army or has any kind of military training or interest, this book is for you, because it goes into the most incredible detail of, positions and weapons used, and basically an autopsy of what happened and what they could have done differently, and a really, really interesting book. But some of the conditions that he alludes to for the ambush really enforce the chaos of it all. I'm going to read one section from it here, basically talking about the false surrender. It's on page 93 of the book if you have it. It is during this phase of the operation that controversy emerges. Did the ADRIC, that's the Auxiliary Division of the Royal Irish Constabulary, members indicate to the IRA, which were the Irish Republican Army attackers, also known as the Volunteers, which I usually refer to them as, back to the piece, that they wanted to surrender? Did the IRA call on the ADRIC to surrender? Confusion abounds, with Barry suggesting that the offer to surrender originated with the ADRIC members, while other column members recollect the IRA calling on the ADRIC to lay down their arms. How difficult could it have been to determine the origin of such a crucial piece of information? The confusion could be explained by the extreme noise levels experienced by both sides during the course of the engagement. Verbal communication in the presence of sustained gunfire is extremely difficult. The noise from gunfire is described as impulse noise, a noise of short duration and high intensity with a characteristic waveform. Such impulse noise from rifle gunfire can create a sound pressure level of between 100 to 110 decibels, up to 152 decibels for some modern assault rifles. To put this in context, it compares to sound levels greater than those emitted by a pneumatic drill or of the average disco. The percentage hearing disability that such levels of noise intensity produces is 100%. A simple experiment of trying to communicate with someone over a distance of 35 yards, either in a disco or with a set of headphones at full volume, gives a good indication of the challenges that the combatants had in terms of communicating with someone outside their immediate vicinity. These challenges were the reason why whistle blasts were chosen to indicate particular actions. Barry would have been well aware of the difficulty in trying to communicate with his troops by shouting orders over gunfire. They simply would not have heard him. Therefore, it is unlikely that any of the combatants could declare with certainty exactly what they had heard. This is further reinforced by studies that suggest that temporary hearing impairment is possible even after a short exposure to such levels of noise interference. So that'll give you an understanding of how difficult it would have been to hear anything at all during the engagement. But to move on, one of the first people to really call out and question whether there was a false surrender was a Canadian historian called Peter Hart. He published a book called The IRA and Its Enemies in 1998, and it caused an awful lot of controversy over the years. Now, Peter Hart has actually died since. He died of cancer, I think 2010, 2014, somewhere. I could be wrong there, but I know he has passed on. But in this book, Hart has some very strong criticisms throughout, not just about Kilmichael, but of other incidents that we can go into in other podcasts. But to keep it focused, I'm going to just focus on the Kilmichael Ambush today. So in this book, he even calls Tom Barry a liar outright at one stage. And one of the other important people to learn about as we talk about Peter Hart and some of the other testimonies here is Father John Chisholm, and he died in 2014, but he actually helped Liam Deasy to put the book Towards Ireland Free together. And according to Eve Morrison, who we'll talk about later, but we heard from last week, her book on Kilmichael, Father Chisholm was an incredibly educated man who actually held 3 doctorates, and he lectured in philosophy in UCD. And in 1969, he and Deasy spoke, and Deasy recommended 30 men that would be good to interview. And Father Chisholm actually recorded all of those interviews, and they later became known as the Chisholm tapes. But Peter Hart actually had access to these tapes as he was writing, and as far as I know, those tapes haven't been made publicly available just yet. But Hart actually opens a chapter on Kilmichael by showing the global impact of the success of Kilmichael. He says, in West Cork and in Ireland as a whole, Kilmichael became the most celebrated victory of rebel arms, the archetypical ambush. Tom Barry, the column commander, became a folk hero and a revolutionary celebrity. Barry's and Kilmichael's fame even reached beyond the borders of Ireland. It jerked the people of India to a new appraisal of their position. Egypt stood amazed. It ultimately pervaded darkest Africa. The German army studied the ambush in the Second World War, and Barry's memoirs became required reading at military academies, including Sandhurst and West Point. Most impressive of all, it has been reported that when the Japanese army captured Singapore, they marched in singing The Boys of Kilmichael. It doesn't state here actually, but there's a connection between Singapore, that surrender, and West Cork, because the commander of the British garrison in Bandon was Major Arthur Percival, and he was, I suppose, the biggest enemy of Tom Barry and the West Cork Volunteers. But Percival himself was actually a lieutenant general, and he surrendered the British forces to the Japanese in Singapore, leading to a telegram from Tom Barry later on, in which he congratulated Percival for his defence of Singapore. But in the last episode, I mentioned some of the contradictions in the statements that Tom Barry had seemingly made in the years after the ambush, before he wrote Guerrilla Days in Ireland in 1949. And Peter Hart says in his book, to further muddy the waters, Barry wrote earlier descriptions of the ambush, which seemed to undermine his later claims. To begin with, there in his original after-action report written for his superiors, the column paraded at 3:15 a.m. on Sunday morning. It comprised 32 men armed with rifles, bayonets, 5 revolvers, and 100 rounds of ammunition per man. We marched for 4 hours and reached a position on the Macroom-Dunmanway Road. We camped in that position until 4:15 p.m. and then decided that as the enemy searches were completed, that it would be safe to return to our camp. Accordingly, we started the return journey. About 5 minutes after the start, we sighted 2 enemy lorries moving at a distance of about 1900 yards from us. The country in that particular district is of a hilly and rocky nature. and although suitable to fighting, it is not at all suitable to retiring without being seen. I decided to attack the lorries. The action was carried out successfully. 16 of the enemy who were belonging to the auxiliary police from Macroom Castle being killed, 1 wounded and escaped, and is now missing. P.S. I attribute our casualties to the fact that those 3 men who were too anxious to get into close quarters with the enemy. They were our best men and they did not know danger in this or any previous actions. They discarded their cover, and it was not until the finish of the action that P.D.C. was killed by a revolver bullet from one of the enemy whom he thought to be dead. Barry provides remarkably little information about the engagement, in contrast to his later accounts, but he still manages to contradict his later description in several places. No false surrender occurred by this account. The Irish deaths are attributed to their own carelessness. Curiously, he also suggests that the column was not seeking action but evading it, and that the ambush was an unavoidable last-minute affair. Barry wrote another account of Kilmichael in 1932. After bombing the first lorry, the IRA and auxiliaries were engaged in a death struggle. After 8 or 10 minutes of terrific fighting, the first lorry of the enemy was overcome and a party of 3 men advanced up the road to help the second section. They were firing as they advanced to the relief of their sorely pressed comrades, 3 of whom had already fallen. The end was at hand, and in a short time, the remainder of the auxiliaries fighting the second section were dead. They, like the IRA, had fought to the finish. Again, no trick surrender. The 3 IRA casualties had already been hit by the time Barry and his party ran to help, and the auxiliaries then manfully fought to a finish, a direct contradiction, in substance and in tone, of what he wrote in 1949. What makes these accounts doubly interesting is Barry's reaction to Paddy O'Brien's recollections of Kilmichael, published in Liam Deasy's memoirs, Towards Ireland Free, in 1974. O'Brien describes the battle around the second lorry as follows. The auxiliaries had jumped out. We then opened fire from their rear, and when they realised that they were caught between 2 fires, they knew that they were doomed. It was then realised that 3 of our men had been killed. Barry was infuriated by this fantastic story, which he felt depicted me as a bloody-minded commander who exterminated the auxiliaries without reason. It was, he insisted, the false surrender after which the IRA freedom fighters were treacherously killed, which ensured the extermination of the auxiliaries concerned. These wild denunciations are not very convincing, but they are revealing. O'Brien's account does not paint Barry as bloodthirsty. It merely describes a short but a grim fight in which, as in Barry's 1932 article, the IRA and the police fought to a finish. It is Barry who introduces the issue of extermination, and who clearly feels very defensive about this. Why? Because in the interview quoted above, and in his memoirs, he says again that, after the bogus surrender, several cadets shouted, "We surrender," a second time, but that the guerrillas kept on firing until all had been killed. So, if there was no trick, the auxiliaries were gunned down for no reason. Yet we know that Barry himself made no mention of a false surrender in 1920 and in 1932. What really happened at Kilmichael? So you can see, after that was published, why there would have been some big questions about the false surrender. It seemed like Barry was contradicting himself. But Meda Ryan, who lived in Bandon, I believe, and is now possibly living somewhere up the country, but she was a fantastic historian, and she raises the possibility that the first document is entirely fake in the first place, a piece of British propaganda, and she actually dissects it very well over a chapter in her biography of Tom Barry. Now, I'm not going to read it out because it's very long, but if you can get your hands on it, Meda makes some very, very compelling points. And also, on the other account, the one from the Irish Press paper in 1932 that Peter Hart talks to, what Peter Hart didn't mention in his book was that that article was followed up by a letter to the editor from Tom Barry, stating that he was extremely unhappy that this article was not published as written by him, and the full letter is actually included in Meda's book. Now, Peter didn't mention it, but that could be because he didn't have it, because Meda Ryan actually had access to all of Tom's papers, whereas Peter didn't. But I'm going to read a segment from that letter that Tom Barry sent to the editor of the Irish Press. And in it he says, I know you mentioned that you have to omit any details that you feel would be libelous, and also that space in your paper was a consideration. However, important facts should not have been omitted. While you left other details in, you crammed the ambush into one small paragraph. One of the most important facts of the Kilmichael Ambush was the false surrenders by the Auxies. 3 of our lads thought it was all over and stood up. The Auxies began to shoot again, and after shouting, "We surrender," that is why I shouted, "Rapid fire, and do not stop until I tell you." So that can pretty much put to bed why it wasn't mentioned in the 1932 Irish press paper. And the other one, in the immediate aftermath account that I read first, a few chapters later though, Hart actually does suggest a reason why Tom might have omitted the false surrender from his initial report in 1920, if in fact that was a genuine document. Hart wrote, "This ruthlessness was well demonstrated in Tom Barry's planning for Kilmichael. The terrain at the ambush site was rocky and barren, and the column was placed at very close to the road, allowing only for attack and not for retreat. Everything was staked on achieving surprise. If the auxiliaries were alert and gained the upper hand, the column would be trapped. Barry was intent on total victory. He gave an order to fix bayonets and posted men to prevent any auxiliaries escaping. It was to be a fight to the finish," he declared. Barry did not tell his men the plan, or his choice of target, until the last minute, and he did not tell his superiors at all. They might well have stopped him if they had known, and this may account for his claim in the 1920 report that the encounter was unplanned. So that's almost in defence of Tom there, but then Hart shows what he really feels about Tom Barry. A couple of pages later, "The account which emerges from detailed interviews with survivors supports much of the official British story. The auxiliaries were decoyed by what appeared to be a British officer and attacked by men wearing steel helmets and carrying service rifles with fixed bayonets. Helpless wounded men and prisoners were killed after the battle was over. Axes and shotguns were not used, but bayonets and revolvers at point-blank range were. In retrospect, British information seems to have been remarkably accurate. Barry's history of Kilmichael, on the other hand, is riddled with lies and evasions. There was no false surrender as he described it. The surviving auxiliaries were simply exterminated." I don't think it's right for any kind of a historian to make such big claims like that when there were so many other accounts backing up Tom Barry and his team, but again, there were other accounts that said there was no false surrender. He laid it bare there, but I suppose to follow on from that, very quickly after, he actually includes a quote from General Crozier, who was the head of the auxiliaries in Ireland at the time, and in his book Ireland Forever, Crozier states that it was perfectly true that the wounded had been put to death after the ambush, but the reason for this barbarous inhumanity became understandable, although inexcusable. Arms were supposed to have been surrendered, but a wounded auxiliary whipped out a revolver while lying on the ground and shot a shinner, with the result that all his comrades were put to death with him, the rebels seeing red, a condition akin to going mad. Not long after, actually, Crozier resigned as the head of the auxiliaries, and the reason for that is stated again in Meda Ryan's biography of Tom Barry. Crozier said that the auxiliary police were soldiers in disguise under no army and no RIC code. His endorsement is weighty. He resigned from his position because the combat was being carried out on foul lines by selected and foul men for a grossly foul purpose, based on the most satanic of all rules that the end justifies the means. There was an admission by the hierarchy of the British Army that there were atrocities being carried out in the name of the British Army, sullying the name of good soldiers who fought throughout World War I, and there were some cases there that Tom Barry and other people mention of very decent treatment by soldiers in Ireland. So later on in the podcast, I'm going to look at some of the sources that Hart quoted, even though they were anonymous. And Meda Ryan actually dissects those very, very well in her biography of Tom Barry. But first, I'm going to continue with the case against the false surrender, and I'll go back to Eve Morrison's book on Kilmichael, which I think is the latest book on Kilmichael. And look, there's no denying that there was an incredible amount of research put into this book. It really is a fantastic resource for the expanded picture of Kilmichael as a whole, and I highly recommend picking up a copy of it. It covers a lot of the Father Chisholm interviews, which, unfortunately, like I was saying, have never been made public. And there's a segment here that I want to read from it, and it's actually taken from those Father Chisholm interviews with some of the survivors of Kilmichael. Eve writes, "In all of Jack O'Sullivan's accounts, he attributed the IRA fatalities to 2 auxiliaries who had, as he said to O'Dulong, done the damage. He said both Jim O'Sullivan and McCarthy were shot by auxiliaries fighting from a prone position in the road. When speaking to Chisholm, he also said that it had been the wrong thing to say that McCarthy got up out of his position and got shot." And here's a transcript of the conversation. Chisholm: "The men then that jumped out, the auxiliaries who jumped out in the road, they lay down on the road?" O'Sullivan: "They did, and any of them that were able to lay down and were able to fire." Chisholm: "Able to fire, so they got down on the road. Now, they were, of course, shot by the volunteers?" O'Sullivan: "Yes." Chisholm: "Yes. Now, you would say that McCarthy was then shot by one of them from across the road, one of the auxiliaries from the road?" O'Sullivan: I would. Chisholm: "And the same would hold for Jim O'Sullivan?" O'Sullivan: "I would, because they continued. No matter how we tried, they were able to continue firing, because, like now, you're laying there, you are laying there, and McCarthy and his section are there, and there were, at that time, there was a little dyke in the road, and they were laying in that little dyke, and even now, it would be hard to pick out a man laying down like that." Ned Young likewise said the auxiliaries laid down onto the road and fought until the last man. According to Hart's notes made while listening to a recording of the interview Jack O'Sullivan's son conducted with his father, Jack O'Sullivan said that the volunteers in Section 2 were incensed at the deaths of their comrades, and that these 2 auxiliaries were killed, not because of any trickery on their part, but in revenge. "No, there was no such thing as a surrender. The stories that were told afterwards that they were screaming and cursing, where we were, there weren't. A murmur. They died without saying a word, and asked for no mercy, and got no mercy. They died, to my mind, a cruel death, because the men that were in Mick McCarthy, where he was shot, they knew their 2 men were shot, and they came out and they shot him, and I think a bayonet was used on one of them, or maybe 2 of them. They put up their hands and went down the road and went back the road. The firing was stopped. I don't know who gave the signal. We knew it was all over when we saw our men getting out on the road." O'Sullivan described these 2 auxiliaries to Father Chisholm. Chisholm: "So you then saw that the volunteers were, or as is to say, the auxiliaries were being shot and killed on the road, but the 2 of them were left?" O'Sullivan: 2 of them were left, and I don't believe that they were ever wounded while they were laying on the road." Chisholm: "No." O'Sullivan: "I seen them getting up perfect, everybody putting up their hands, going back up the roads towards..." Chisholm: "You saw them, and they left their guns down." O'Sullivan: "Left their guns." Whoever the 2 auxiliaries were, O'Sullivan did not say that they ever pretended to surrender. He says they eventually just surrendered. According to O'Sullivan, they fought so hard and skillfully that the volunteers in Section 2 were unable to dislodge them. Barry and his unit did that. If, as O'Sullivan maintained, these 2 auxiliaries were responsible for the IRA fatalities, which most accounts say occurred during the initial exchanges between Section 2 and the 2nd Lorry, and were then killed by volunteers enraged at the death of their comrades, this is not a surprising outcome. Surrendering, as military historians have noted, is always a distinctly risky practice given the propensity of soldiers to kill rather than take prisoners. Veterans also say, either explicitly or by implication, that wounded auxiliaries were finished off at both the 1st and 2nd lorries, and that some were killed after genuinely trying to surrender. Barnes, Leonard, Bradshaw, Alfred Jones and William Hooper Jones were all wounded in the axilla, the armpit. Sean A. Murphy came to the same conclusion that I did in 2012, that these men were most likely shot with their arms in the air. Barnes and Jones were found between the 2nd lorry and the rocks where McCarthy and Hennessy were positioned in Section 2. Bradshaw and Hooper Jones were in the vicinity of Section 1. So it's actually a little bit difficult to follow there in some places, especially in big paragraph there by O'Sullivan. I wanted to read it as it is written to do justice to their testimony, but there's some powerful stuff in there. Did they see red? Did the volunteers see that their two comrades, their friends, men that they probably grew up playing football and hurling with, well, mainly hurling at the time, I suppose. I don't know the relationship, if there was a relationship, but these men were generally from the same communities. Did they see red when they saw their friends killed and just decide not to take prisoners? It's a damning indictment there in that testimony, but that's not the final word on it. So we have heard there from those who said that there wasn't a false surrender, but there is some powerful testimony to say that there was. And the first is from Tom Barry's memoir, Guerrilla Days in Ireland. That was his official and final account of what happened in Kilmichael. And in last week's podcast, I read the full account of the ambush from his perspective, which included the false surrender. So I highly recommend you listen to that if you're interested, or you can pick up a copy of Guerrilla Days in Ireland, which, as far as I know, is still in print from Mercier. And I know a lot of those claims that were made by Peter Hart were reinforced by Eve Morrison, but the initial claims were examined by Meda Ryan in her biography of Tom Barry. And Meda wrote some great books on the Irish Revolutionary period and some of the revolutionaries like Liam Lynch. She wrote the book The Day Michael Collins Was Shot. That is a controversial book too, based on some of the sources. But I think the access that Meda actually had to the men of the West Cork brigades later in life makes her a very, very solid source of information. And she also had access to the papers of Tom Barry, who, as far as I remember reading somewhere, it could have been in her book, I think it was, they were about to be thrown out after Tom Barry died. Some of them were in an awful condition. They were in a black bag and they were basically salvaged by somebody when they were gutting Tom Barry's apartment, who, if you've listened to previous podcasts, would know that that apartment was above the main McDonald's on the Grand Parade in Cork. That's where he died at the age of 83 in, I think, 1980. But going back to Meda's book, she directly referenced the sources in Peter Hart's books and really challenged the claims he was making and questioned the authenticity of those sources, which has always been a point of contention when people are talking about Peter's book. Meda wrote, Peter Hart stated that Jim O'Sullivan and Michael McCarthy were hit in the head and killed where they lay. In a footnote he wrote, all of the men interviewed agreed on this point. McCarthy and O'Sullivan did not stand up and did not die because of a fake surrender. Two of those veterans considered Barry's account to be an insult to the memory of these men. Dan Howrahan, who was beside Jim O'Sullivan, told me, I'll never forget it, same as 'twas only yesterday. After they shouted did they surrender, it was silence. Jim lifted himself, thought it was over, God rest his soul. He paused for a silent memory. Dan was captured afterwards while on the run. He was imprisoned in Spike Island and was severely beaten several times. His fingernails and toenails were pulled out. Part of the index finger of his left hand was snapped off. Michael McCarthy was beside Jack Hennessy. Hennessy claimed he almost got up around the same time as McCarthy when the Ogsy shouted. He thought it was all over, but ducked and was wounded in the scalp. Hennessy and Howrahan went over this many times and often wondered if there was something they could have done. McCarthy had got a bullet through the head and lay dead. I continued to load and fire, but the blood dripped from my forehead and blocked the breech of my rifle. I dropped the rifle and picked up McCarthy's. So that was from Dan Howrahan, who was beside Jim O'Sullivan on the day, and Jack Hennessy, who was beside Michael McCarthy, two of the casualties of Kilmichael, and the third, of course, being Pat Deasy, the brother of Liam Deasy. But to look at some of the sources here that Peter Hart used for his book, there's a lot of mystery around them, and Meda addresses this also. Meda wrote, Peter Hart gives an account of an interview he conducted with AF, a scout. One IRA man came upon a wounded auxiliary, crying after me, and I told Barry. He said, finish him, placed his revolver to the man's head and pulled the trigger. Barry made us, said another. He shot one, then we shot one. Eventually each man was shot in the head. Some of the volunteers apparently refused to take part, and several were getting hysterical from the shock of so much death on both sides. This interview is puzzling. It's unclear as to whether AF engaged in some shooting, yet as a scout he would have been unarmed and positioned at a distance from the ambush site. In a footnote he wrote that the quotations are from the interview with AF. A previous footnote states, one witness, AF, a scout, 19th November 1989, rather than a rifleman, and therefore further away from the ambush site than the other interviewees, saw several auxiliaries surrender after the 3 volunteers were hit, but then heard further firing, some of which he believed came from the Englishmen. Because of this, he says there was a sort of a false surrender, but no IRA men died as a result. According to records available, the last of the 3 unarmed scouts, Dan O'Driscoll, died in 1967. Scouts were not a small fry, as described by Peter Hart. A scout's job during an ambush was onerous, mainly to alert the men to the arrival of any enemy help. Tom O'Neill, referring to scouts in another context, wrote, "It was often even harder and more dangerous for them than the men who had to go into action." Barry wrote that no one worried if he fought as a rifleman, a section commander, or in any other rank during an action with the enemy. To them nothing mattered but the pursuit of the movement for freedom. The 3 scouts and 2 dispatch scouts, all unarmed at Kilmichael, were too far away from the ambuscade to know if or when a volunteer stood up, was injured or killed during the ambush. One scout at the northern side was over 200 yards away, signalling to the second scout. The third scout was south of the command post, at the other side of the ambuscade. While audibility could be possible at this distance in the existing terrain, visibility by scouts of detailed military action would be most unlikely. Furthermore, the scouts had to remain in their positions until the ambush was over, until the ceasefire. Dispatch scouts moved from the ambuscade once action began. Peter Hart mentions 10 scouts at Kilmichael. Just 3 scouts were on ambush location. After ambush helpers assisted with the wounded and the dead, but they did not participate in the ambush and were not engaged in scouting duty or in other related tasks during the ambush. Furthermore, according to autobiographical details, all the scouts and the after-ambush helpers who were at Kilmichael that day were dead by the late 1970s. All riflemen at Kilmichael were dead by the 19th of November 1989. Peter Hart wrote that the interviewees were extremely nervous about discussing Kilmichael in detail. Therefore, he wrote, names have been withheld to protect confidentiality. Arising out of interviews, he states that, as a large number of these interviewees requested that part or all of their testimony be quoted anonymously, I refer to them using initials only. In a radio program when queried about the names of the interviewees, Peter Hart responded, "Actually, I prefer not to say because I did it under conditions of anonymity, and certainly the 2 men I talked to who were there were rather concerned, and actually their children were rather concerned about what they were saying." Furthermore, Peter Hart has written, "I was also fortunate enough to be given a tour of the ambush site by one of my interviewees." If, including scouts and helpers, records show that the last Kilmichael ambush survivor, Ned Young, whose faculties were impaired during his final years, died on the 13th of November 1989, aged 97. The second last, Jack O'Sullivan, in 1986, Tim O'Connell, 1983, Patrick O'Donovan, 1981, all riflemen. Then who are these people who could not stand over their names and the information that they gave regarding the Kilmichael ambush when Peter Hart interviewed them in 1988 and 1989? Who were all of the men interviewed who agree on this point? McCarthy and O'Sullivan did not stand up and did not die because of a fake surrender. Who were the 2 of these veterans who considered Barry's account to be an insult to the memory of these men who were killed? Scouts were John Kelly, who died in 1959, Tim O'Sullivan, died in 1965, Dan O'Driscoll, died in 1967, and dispatch scouts Neelius Cotter, who died in 1952, and Sean Falvey, died in 1971. From my research, I consulted the published 1938 list plus previous and subsequent records of those involved in the Kilmichael ambush. But Peter Hart wrote that he interviewed 2 people, AA on the 3rd of April, 25th of June 1988, and AF on the 19th of November 1989. Perhaps if Peter Hart revealed their names, the credibility of these two witnesses who claimed to give a first-hand account could be examined. Their version of events to Peter Hart contradicts so many others, and while they remain anonymous, the story of the Kilmichael Ambush will remain clouded in controversy. Peter Hart's tour of the ambush site between 1988 and 89 creates a logistical problem, which only he can solve, as autobiographical details from evidence available shows that all scouts and dispatch scouts were dead by 1971. 97-year-old Ned Young, who was a rifleman, the sole survivor since O'Sullivan's death in 1986, died on the 13th of November 1989. However, if Peter Hart revealed the names of his anonymous sources, the dilemma could be solved. Who was Scout AF who gave Peter Hart on the 19th of November 1989 the graphic account of Tom Barry placing the revolver to the crying man's head to finish him off, then pull the trigger, and of Barry's procedure after the surrendered Englishman had been executed? Jack Lane wrote, "Apart from anything else, the very idea of a participant in the Kilmichael Ambush wanting to remain anonymous 70 years after the event beggars belief. Participants of that period were willing to discuss the awfulness of the ambush and to stand over anything they said when I interviewed them in the 1970s and early 1980s. In fact, all interviewees were proud to have taken such an active part in the fight for freedom and considered the Kilmichael Ambush a landmark. Many of the survivors attended an annual reunion of the anniversary commemoration. The interviews conducted by Father Chisholm in the late 1960s with Kilmichael Ambush participants give horrific accounts of the ambush. None of the participants publicly contradicted Tom Barry's, Stephen O'Neill's or other published accounts that recorded the false surrender story by saying there was no false surrender. I grew up in the area and I listened to people get very angry that the Auxies picked up their guns after the surrender cries. My uncle, Pat O'Donovan, was in number 2 section, where the 3 volunteers who were fatally shot were positioned. He, like others interviewed, said that he had heard the surrender call. Jim O'Sullivan's nieces, Joan and Margaret, grew up with the story from participants that he heard the surrender, got up and was fatally wounded. We never heard anything, ever, only that they were tricked by a false surrender, Joan recalls. In 1956, Jim's brother Con, while on a visit home from Chicago, put the Iron Cross at the number 2 section spot. Lewis White, who had been involved in the Kilmichael Commemoration Committee, said, "We listened to the men over the years as they talked about Kilmichael, and they always talked about the false surrender. In fact, some of them blamed themselves because those other lads were killed. They talked after funerals, at functions, gatherings, after mass. We listened to them in groups, when they were off their guard as it were, and they never talked down the false surrender. It was a fact, and I stand over it." Donald McGillipaul, who was involved with Tom Barry and other survivors in the formation of the Kilmichael Commemoration Committee, never heard any of them disputing the fact that there was a false surrender. All over the years since I knew these men, in the early 1960s, it was in their story of the Kilmichael Ambush. There was no need to doubt them. In fact, I grew up knowing it. Sean Kelleher, also involved with Barry and participants in organising the Kilmichael commemoration events over the years, was adamant that those lads were wronged by that deceitful, false surrender. We went over this so many times. So powerful stuff there, and that's local knowledge that I suppose for a lot of historians might not be strong enough, but their word is as good as anybody else's when we're looking at something that happened 100 years ago. And I know some of these books were written, in the 90s and whatnot, but I want to finish off this segment by reading the testimony of Jack Hennessy, who was next to Michael McCarthy during the ambush. Jack Hennessy, who was a member of number 2 section, outlines a dramatic version of events as he engaged with the second lorry. At this time, the second lorry was just opposite our position. The Auxies jumped out and tried to find cover. The lorry driver held his seat and attempted to back the lorry out of that position. I was engaging the Auxies on the road. I was wearing a tin hat. I had fired about 10 rounds and had got 5 bullets through the hat when the 6th bullet wounded me in the scalp. Vice Commandant McCarthy had got a bullet through the head and lay dead. I continued to load and fire, but the blood dripping from my forehead fouled the breech of my rifle. I dropped my rifle and took Michael McCarthy's. Many of the Auxies lay dead on the road or dying. Our orders were to fix bayonets and charge on the road when we heard the 3 blasts of the OC's whistle. I heard the 3 blasts and got up from my position, shouting hands up. At the same time, one of the Aussies about 5 yards from me drew his revolver. He had thrown down his rifle. I pulled on him and shot him dead. I got back to cover where I remained for a few minutes, firing at living and dead Aussies on the road. The column OC sounded his whistle again. Nearly all the Aussies had been wiped out. When I reached the road, a wounded Aussie moved his hand towards his revolver. I put my bayonet through him under the ribs. Another Aussie tried to pull on John Lorden, who was too near to use his bayonet, and he struck the Aussie with the butt of his rifle. So that's a powerful testimony there of the false surrender, but also it states that Michael McCarthy had died just before it. Again, one of those things that when we look at the false surrender, they've always been between 2 and 3 names that died during it, but we know that those 3 men died anyway during the engagement. So there's a lot to take in there, and they're only slight excerpts from really, really well-researched books. And I think based on everything that I've read from these books mentioned and other books and military service pension reports and Bureau of Military History reports, I do believe that there was a false surrender. I believe that those soldiers threw down their rifles, put their hands up, and shouted, "We surrender," which led to the inexperienced volunteers, possibly just Pat Deasy and Jim O'Sullivan, coming out of cover, and in the darkness, the auxiliaries shot them with their sidearm revolvers. And I do believe that those auxiliaries tried to surrender again, and it wasn't accepted by the volunteers. You know, there's a lot of stories that you hear locally of Tom Barry in his later years breaking down crying over a pint because he didn't warn those young men about the false surrender trick that he said was as old as war itself. And I think that the guilt of what happened weighed very heavy on him in his later years. And I don't think that any of the men involved were lying in the aftermath. I do think that it was mostly confusion of that terrible 20-minute fight on a cold winter's evening of unexperienced men in awful conditions. But it's so easy to look at this situation with a revisionist lens. But I do believe in judging the situation in the context of the time and what was going on in the country back then, and not through the lens of our modern moralities. And even though I know that there's been criticism of both Peter Hart's and Eve Morrison's book, but even if you find some sections that enrage you, I know myself anyway, I try to look past that and what could be seen as revisionist elements to take the best of the research out of them. You know, there have been some books over the years that have had a paragraph in them that made me want to throw it in the bin, but it turned out that there was other useful resources in it. So to use the phrase, you know, I didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but there have been some books that were so bad that the baby, the bathwater and the bat went out the window. But sure, you'll get that. But again, we'll never know the truth of it all. All we can do is examine what's available and make up our own minds. And that's what keeps history interesting, to me anyway. So I'm going to post all of the books used in the making of this 2-part series on my Instagram, which is @Rebel Tales Podcast. And if you're interested, I highly recommend that you pick up those books too, because an hour-long podcast can only fit in so much, and the full books might totally change your mind if you have made a decision based on this podcast of what you think happened. But that's all fine too. But let's just keep the memories of the ordinary people who fought for freedom alive by talking about them. So I want to thank you all for listening. Please do leave a star review on whatever platform you're listening to this on. It really does help. And if you want to see more videos and pictures, please do follow me over on the Instagram. Again, that's @Rebel Tales. I'll be back next week with another Cork ambush. And until then, thanks for listening to Rebel Tales.